Hi everyone, Zach here, and welcome to Lesson 18 of the series, Learning C++ by Making Games. In this video, we'll explore one of our derived variable types known as arrays. If you're struggling on remembering how variables work or what our derived types are, go ahead and look at video 5 from earlier in this series. This video has been brought to you by my Patreon sponsors, such as Nemian Games. That said, let's get started and explore arrays. In this video, we'll go over what arrays are, how to use arrays, and then I'll point you in some directions for more things to learn and what we'll talk about in later sections of this series. So, what is an array? An array is a compound data type or structure. It is a list, in other words, of one type of variable. I'm going to say this multiple times. So it can either be a set of integers, a set of characters, a set of doubles, but it's just that one type. The items in an array are called elements. And again, each element is of the same variable type. So again, either all integers or all characters. And each element of an array can be accessed directly and changed directly. So why do we use an array? Well, arrays save space and there's less chance for programmer error. For example, think if I had 100 variables of one type, say test scores. Well, that means I'd have to have 100 variables with 100 names. It's doable, it's messy, and I'm more prone to make mistakes when I'm trying to get a single one of these variables. So with that said, we use it because it stores a single group of elements with one name. So in other words, all the test scores from a class. And because we can edit these elements as needed, as if they were individual variables or at mass using iterative processes like loops. And there are other reasons to use arrays. Simply put, besides being less prone to make errors, arrays are very efficient, both in terms of executing code and in terms of writing the programs out. And for this reason, in terms of writing programs out and being efficient, they are often used with iterative processes like loops. Now, before we go further on how to actually work with arrays, we need to go over the characteristics of arrays. So, first thing to be aware of is that arrays are of a fixed size. Typically, you cannot change the size without going back into the program and changing the declaration of the array. For the third time, elements of the array are of the same type. The array and its data are stored contiguously in memory. Now, this next part is very important, and it's something else I'm going to repeat repeatedly. Elements in the array are individually accessible by the position, as I've said, and you'll often see the letter I as a variable name used when accessing a particular index. So I would be index. And again, the very, very important part of this is that the first index in an array is 0. So if you want an array that has 100 values in it, it starts at 0 and goes to 99. That said, the last element in the array is the size of the array minus 1. So again, if you have an array with 100 elements, the 100th element is at index 99. So it's 0 to 99. It starts at 0 and it goes to the size of the index minus 1. With arrays, there are some things to be aware of. Again, always remember that arrays start at index 0. A lot of beginners and novices forget this and will make mistakes. This is because we tend to think of counting as going from 1 to 2 to 3, whereas with arrays, we start at 0, so counting would be 0, 1, 2. So if we have an array the size of 100 and we want to access the first element, we access index 0. We want to access the last element, the 100th one, we access index 99. If we want to access the 50th element, we access index 49. Also, you have to initialize your arrays. In fact, best practice says to do so when you declare your array. You can change the elements in your array as you go, you just can't change the size. So you can set your array to have a value of 0 at all indices and then change those at runtime. With some types of arrays, those using strings and characters, you will need null terminators. We'll talk more about this later in the video. And finally, and part of why remembering index 0 is important, is that in C++, arrays do not have any bounds checking. In other words, the bounds are the range of the array. So again, if we have an array size 100, the bounds are 0 and 99. There is no check to make sure that you are calling something that is actually within that range. So there are ways to write checks in, but there's no inherent checks in C++. And if you go out of bounds, so out of the range between 0 and size -1, then you can get errors, you can get random data, you can have the program crash. In fact, in the next video, I'm going to intentionally make a mistake with one of the challenges I'm going to put forward where this can happen. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in some cases. So now that we've talked about what an array is and the characteristics of arrays, let's talk about how we use them. And let's start with our declarations. So declaring an array is like declaring any other variable. You are going to start by saying what the element type is. So this is the variable type. Is it storing integers? Is it storing floats? Is it storing strings? Like any variable, you're going to give it a name. And then instead of using either equals or the curly brackets, you're going to use square brackets and provide a constant number of elements. So this is the size of the array. So for example, if I had a class and I had 100 students in that class and they all took a test and I wanted to score that test as an integer, I would say int test scores, square brackets, 100, and closing square brackets. You can also get the size of your array from another constant variable. So if I wanted to know how long someone exercised per day, instead of declaring the size at 365, I can have a constant integer called days and years that is declared and initialized as 365 and call that constant in my array for its size. But remember what I said earlier. You need to initialize your array. So it is best practice to declare and initialize your arrays in the same step. And again, you can always change the value of individual elements of your array at runtime. So let's look at how we can declare and initialize our arrays. And it's, again, very similar to what we saw a moment ago. We're going to have our element type, our name. Within square brackets, we are going to have the size of our array, and then we're going to have our initialization list. So these are the values in order of index that we are initializing. So some examples are, if we have 5 test scores, we want to declare and initialize them all at once, we'd put all 5 values in there. So in this example of int test scores size of 5, we then have 5 values. So that 98 is at index 0, and that 76 is at index 4. Please note the use of commas between each of the values. We can also leave some blank in there as well. So we have that same array, we have the same size, but I only declare the first 2 values, 98 and 65. So indices 0 and 1. The other 3 indices, 2 through 4, will be initialized as 0. If I want to initialize all the values as 0, I can say the size of the array and then use the curly brackets and put a 0 in. So all elements of this array are initialized to 0. And I don't actually need to say the size of the array. I can just declare I want an array and allow the system, the compiler that is, to determine the size of my array when it compiles. So in this case, I have my int test scores, my square brackets with no size in it, and then I have a set of values. There are 10 values in there, so the compiler will initialize the array of test scores in memory to a size of 10. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some things to be aware of when using arrays that store strings or characters. And I mentioned in particular the use of the null terminator. So let's start there. When you have an array of strings or characters, the final element in the array needs to be a null terminator, which will be a single quote, a slash, a zero, and a closing quote sign. So if you do not use this, you will get garbage data spat out by the system when you try to read the array or when you try to output the array. It is important to have this in there. For other reasons as well, it will prevent other errors from cropping up. Like when you are declaring a single character or a string variable, you need to use single quotes around each of the array elements. The commas will go outside of the quotes. And if an array is dynamically filled, then you should initialize it only with null terminators. I would strongly recommend against doing this for characters, at the very least, because you don't know the array size. We will do this in Hangman, but that's because we know the array size we're using. But there are better alternatives to use when the size is not known, and I'll mention those alternatives in the last slide of this video. So now we know how to declare and initialize arrays. We know some of the caveats to be aware of with strings and character arrays. Let's talk about how we access an individual element, and it's fairly simple. All we have to do, just like with other variables, is call the array name up and the element's index. So that's the only difference. All we're doing is saying we want this array, square bracket, at this particular index. So if we want the first element, we would say the array name, square bracket, 0, closing square bracket. If we wanted the third element, it'd be the array's name and our bracket with a 2 in it. So for example, we could have something like this, where we output all the test scores. So we have the test score, the first test score, which is at index 0 of 98. We have the second test score at index 1 of 65, the third at index 2 of 43, the fourth at index 3 of 100, and the final and fifth test score at index 4 of 76. Now, my example is a poor way of doing this. There are better ways to write this code using loops, and we will explore that in the next video. But if you want a refresher on loops, I strongly recommend going back to the earlier videos from the first game we made and look at videos 9 through 11. So now that we've talked about storing and accessing elements of an array, we can talk about changing these elements. And there are two approaches to doing this. There is assignment and input, and both can be used, and they can both be used on their own or within loops or in conjunction with each other. You can combine this to do a lot of things. So with assignment method, it's very similar to what we've done previously in that we'll say what we're looking for. So let's say we have an array of test scores and we have 5 indices in there, and we're going to initialize all the elements to 0 at the start. If we want to change the first element, then we do test scores, so the array name, the index we want to change, so that first element is 0, and we're going to assign it the value of 90. Let's say we have that same array of 5 test scores initialized at 0. The first one is now 90 though, because we just changed it with the assignment method, and we want to have the user input the other values. What we can do is we can have a cin, and we can say we want the next value, so the second index, or the second value, the first index that is, to be changed, and we just say cin to test scores at index 1, and when the user hits enter, the inputted value will be assigned to the first element or the first index of that array. So this really covers the basics of arrays. There's a lot you can do with them, particularly when you get comfortable using arrays in loops, which we'll explore in the next video. But there is more to learn. Please remember, I do put links in the description for further reading to learn more about these sort of elements we're looking at and things you can do with them. In the next video, I'll actually be providing challenges for you to work on to get comfortable with loops. Now, there are other types of arrays we haven't talked about, like multi-dimensional arrays. We'll explore these in a later section of this series, and there are other compound variable types like vectors. Again, we'll explore these later in the series, but I just want to point out that vectors are very similar to arrays, but they can be dynamically changed with regards to their size. And when I was talking about strings and characters earlier, and I mentioned there were better alternatives to use, this was that alternative I meant. Alright, again, this covers everything we need to do in this video. We'll explore this further when we look at looping, and we'll talk more about this throughout the rest of the series, of course. So the next video will be on looping, and we're going to start setting up how we are going to input our word list into our Hangman game. Alright, that said, if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help this channel out. And if you want to make sure you're here for the next set of videos, hit that subscribe and notify icon. And consider helping this channel out further by becoming a supporter on Patreon. That said, I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.